Thank you for praying. During this Advent season, we are going to focus our attention on angels, because in the story, the account, the description of the birth of Jesus, angels play an important role. And it's appropriate, I believe, for us to start in the book of Daniel, because here in Daniel chapter 8, we have what is the first angel sighting in the Old Testament, in the Scriptures. And it is instructive to us as to who and what angels are and what function they have in God's creation. So would you turn with me, please, to Daniel chapter 8. We're going to read verses 15 to 27, just so that we have it in context. But I'll let you know in advance that the vision itself and its interpretation and all those details, we will not get into this morning. That's a very deep rabbit hole, and it might take us all morning just to get through that. But instead, we're going to focus on the angel and his effect on the prophet Daniel. So chapter 8, verse 15. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. We come to the Lord's presence this morning seeking understanding and believing that by His Spirit this truth will be opened before us. Years ago, there was a man who lived on Long Island, New York, who ordered an expensive barometer. He wanted to know what kind of weather was coming, and he searched for the most precise instrument he could find and ordered it. It was advertised as a precision scientific instrument, a reliable guide for predicting the weather. When it arrived, extremely disappointed to find that the dial was stuck, the arrow pointing to hurricane. Clouds of skies. So he jiggled it, and he wrapped it, and he tapped on it, and did everything he could to dislodge it from that mistaken position. But after several tries, he gave up on it. He sat down at his desk and wrote a scorching letter to the manufacturer, the one from which he purchased the instrument. The following morning, on his way to his office in New York City, he mailed the letter. After a long day at work, he returned late at home to Long Island to find the barometer missing, and the rest of his house as well. There had been a hurricane. When we receive bad news, we often want to blame the messenger. We often want to be upset. And our tendency is what we observe here in Daniel. After the first of these angel sightings. Daniel lived during a time when the Old Testament people of God were conquered by an enemy nation called the Babylonians. They were fulfilling God's prophecy of 70 years of captivity in a foreign land. Daniel was among the best and brightest young men in Judah. And so the Babylonians, when they brought him over to their country, recognized his potential, trained him for leadership, and used him, giving him considerable authority in their government. The appearance of the angel Gabriel in chapter 8 is to explain images that Daniel had already received in chapters 2 and 7. Here's what we can learn this morning, friends. God's messages, whether we see them as good news or bad news, God's messages demand a faithful response. Not a fearful one, but a faithful one. First point of this understanding. We understand from this passage and from others that angels are God's messengers, and that sometimes the messages they bring can be disturbing. That is seen in this passage in a couple of instances. But first we learn two things about angels. From verse 15, we learn that angels can take on the appearance of humans. They can appear to be a human being. Look at verse 15, and Daniel describes his visitor as one who looked like a man. The Hebrew word for man in this verse is literally strong man. So if it helps, picture Arnold Schwarzenegger in a robe. Daniel, I come to you. Interestingly, the name of this angel is based on that Hebrew word. The word is Gabriel, and the angel's name is Gabriel. Can you hear the similarity? So the name Gabriel literally means strong man of God. How cool is that? Now, only in Daniel, among all the books of the Old Testament, are any angels named. One is Gabriel and the other is Michael, and those names will also appear in the New Testament. And the fact that they are named may imply a greater rank, that they were somehow archangels or were in charge of the heavenly host in a way that is similar to ranks in a military organization. But notice how Daniel describes this visitation. I mean, he, as an angel appeared to him, he hears the voice of God, but how he soft pedals it. Here's one that looked like a man. He heard a voice that sounds like a man's voice, when he could have easily have gotten very dramatic and really went into some supernatural details. It was a divine visit, no doubt. But Daniel didn't make a big deal out of it. visit. It was the vision that really got him. It wasn't the messenger. It was the message. Angels are messengers. This is the second thing, to deliver God's messages to his people. Look at verse 16, where the voice says, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. So we've learned that angels can take on the appearance of human beings. We've learned that they bring messages from God. And now, how did Daniel react to it? The text tells us that he was disturbed by the vision and by the visitation. Verse 17, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Interestingly, that's the same position that Queen Esther took when she approached the king of Babylon in Esther chapter 5, verse 2. So this would be a typical reaction or approach to royalty, one of extreme self-humiliation. Interestingly, this is also what happened to the Apostle John when in Revelation chapter 1, verse 17, he met the Son of Man in his vision. So he got down on his face before Christ. Esther got down on her face before the king, though he was her husband. And Daniel got down on his face before the angel Gabriel. Look at verse 18. I was in a deep sleep. You want to say, Daniel, this is no time for a nap. Well, the word for sleep here is used in other parts of the Old Testament to describe a trance-like state in which a prophet received a vision. So this isn't Daniel swooning. This isn't Daniel taking a little nap. It's Daniel going into this dreamlike state to receive this word from the Lord. His face to the ground, again, a sign of self-humiliation. Then go down all the way to the end of the passage we read, verse 27. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill several days. I was appalled by the vision that was beyond understanding. Now, I think all of us have had a nightmare that has so shocked or frightened us or bewildered us that it was hard or even impossible to get back to sleep. But I don't think many of us have had a nightmare or a vision or a dream that left us ill and exhausted for many days. This was so profoundly affecting that it drained all of the vigor out of Daniel. Isn't it interesting that he used the word appalled? That word can also be translated as desolate, devastated, wasted, helpless. It is an extreme condition. And the visitation and the vision deeply saddened Daniel. And I think because when you boil all of it down, the ram, the goat, this king, that king, yada, yada, it communicated to Daniel that one day his people would have to suffer more persecution. Now put yourself in Daniel's place for just a second. Your country has been conquered. You are part of a group of people who were taken out of your home and taken far away to a foreign land. And you've been put into service of the king in a foreign culture. And God has said, this will last 70 years, but it's going to last 70 years. And maybe like Daniel, you would think, well, that's okay, that's enough. That ought to be enough, hasn't it? Haven't we suffered enough? And then you get this vision. No, there's more to come. Even beyond that 70 years, because the people would not learn their lesson, and they would not obey God. they would not return. So naturally you would be appalled. You would be devastated. You would be confused by this. Well, let's look at it and see just very briefly what we can understand of it. The first thing we can understand of this vision is that it looks ahead to a future time. In fact, in verse 26, it says, the distant future. Now, that's distant from Daniel's perspective, obviously. But it refers to a time ahead. In verse 19, we find the expression, a time of wrath. Now, in the Old Testament, this is used in many different ways. One is a period of God's wrath on the people of God because of their unfaithfulness. It's also used as a period of God's wrath against the foreign enemies of God's people for what they have done to persecute God's people. It is third used for the end of one historical era and the beginning of another. For example, the end of the reign of King David and the beginning of the reign of his son Solomon. And fourth, it refers to a distant future where the reality as we know it comes to an end and God brings in a new creation. And so in the light of all of these possible meanings, we need to be careful in Daniel especially to read into what we think this means. The second thing we can say for sure about it is in verse 25. This vision depicts the victory of God over the forces of evil in the world. Look at what it says in verse 25. Yet he will be destroyed, referring to this king, but not by human power. So the vision promises that there will be more suffering. The vision promises that at the end of that suffering, God is victorious. So be steadfast. And the third thing we see for sure here is that this vision was beyond the understanding of Daniel. And friends, if somebody like Daniel didn't get it, there hadn't better be any of us that come along and say, oh, I figured it out. We need some humility. The second and final point here we won't spend much time on, but how do we react when we receive disturbing news? When things come along in our life, as they are wont to do, that are devastating, appalling, difficult. Well, first we should follow Daniel's example, because what he does in the very next chapter, you will notice in chapter 9, is a lengthy prayer. Daniel received this vision. He was made sick by it, but when he rose up from it, he not only went back to work, but he went back to prayer. And he trusted in God. And this prayer, if you read it, recounts all of the deeds of God, the mighty works that he did on behalf of his people. And it's as if Daniel is saying, look, God, you've done all of this for us in the past. How's about you help us out in these future times? The second thing we can do when we receive ill tidings, bad news, is to be shocked, yes, but to be shocked into action, not frozen with fear. Not frozen with fear. Now, I want you to know I wrote that several days ago before this weather, not knowing how appropriate it would be. Gabriel ordered Daniel to seal up the prophecy until the time was fulfilled. And interestingly, Daniel did not put a physical seal upon it, but a linguistic one. The first 7 chapters of Daniel are written in Aramaic. Aramaic is a language that his Babylonian captors would have spoken or read or understood. But from chapter 8 on, the book is written in Hebrew, which his captors would not have been able to read or understand. And so he sealed it up. in his own language, so that God could preserve this word for us. And then later, hundreds of years later, the Apostle Paul would come along and explain the mystery of salvation. We see this morning that God's messages to us demand a faithful, not a fearful response. As you can imagine, if you Google angel sightings, you get quite a variety of stuff. I found a website that claimed to have photographic evidence of angels. Of course, there was another website that had photographic sightings of Santa Claus, so you see the problem. When we try to use science or reason or worldly things to prove the existence of God, when we try to convince people of the reality of spiritual things by using earthly means, we inevitably run aground. So we are going to limit our search for angels to the pages of Scripture. And we're going to have plenty of material to understand this race that God created for worship and for service and for what they are going to be doing to announce the coming of the Christ child and the birth of the Christ child in our lives. And as we go forth in the days of Advent ahead, I pray that you will keep this thought in your mind, that God's message to us is good news. And it demands a faithful response. Part of the good news is expressed in this table that is set before us. It is a communion table. And we call it that because we are in communion with God through Jesus Christ. We are in communion with one another as we share the bread and the cup. I want to invite you to take your songbook, please, and turn to 460.